Night falls at the mouth of the Netravati River. The sea wind shifts. The tide pulls back, exposing channels only locals know how to read. Small boats without lamps slide through the mangroves, hugging the water like shadows. In the bay, Portuguese galleons lie at anchor, their crews drinking to the capture of Ullal. In the darkness, hundreds of Agnivana fire arrows are lit at once. The order does not come from a European admiral. It comes from Rani Abbakka Chowta, a Jain queen leading a Hindu-Muslim alliance. A small kingdom wins with terrain, timing, and will. Kanara Coast, 16th century. This shore is narrow, humid, crowded with rivers that refuse to stay still. Monsoon rains redraw the map every year. Sandbars appear, disappear. Harbors migrate. For merchants, this coast is opportunity. For empires, it is a problem. And for more than 4 decades, it refuses to submit. By the time Rani Abbakka Chowta comes into full power at Ullal, the Portuguese are no longer explorers. They are managers of violence. The Estado da India is a machine built to tax movement, license, trade, and punish defiance. Cartaz passes decide who sails, who trades, who lives. Cannon fire enforces paperwork. Compliance is cheaper than resistance. Most coastal rulers accept the terms. Abbakka does not. This is not a brief rebellion or a symbolic stand. It is sustained opposition across generations of Portuguese commanders. Governors arrive confident. Admirals rotate in with fresh ships. Campaigns are announced as final. And yet Ullal remains open, trading directly with Arab merchants, bypassing Goa, ignoring Lisbon's rules. Each time the Portuguese escalate, the resistance adapts. When fleets grow larger, Abbakka avoids open water. When cannons multiply, she disappears into rivers. When fortresses rise, she attacks supply lines instead of walls. Victory here is not measured by territory taken. It is measured by systems denied. For Portugal, Ullal becomes an irritation that refuses to be solved. Not large enough to justify total war. Too defiant to be ignored. Every failed expedition drains money, credibility, and morale. Every dead commander becomes a question, whispered in Goa. Why does this small kingdom keep surviving? Because Abbakka understands something. Empires often forget. Maritime power is not just ships and guns. It is rhythm, wind, tides, local knowledge accumulated over centuries. The Portuguese dominate oceans. Abbakka controls thresholds, river mouths, estuaries, night passages, where deep draft ships become liabilities. This is not romantic resistance. It is logistical warfare. She does not rule by spectacle. She rules by continuity. Trade continues. Taxes are collected. Alliances are maintained across religious lines without ceremony. Hindu warriors, Muslim sailors, Jain rulers, the coalition holds because its purpose is practical, not ideological. The result is unprecedented. A coastal queen ruling a small port kingdom outlasts multiple governors of a global maritime empire. Portuguese records mention her repeatedly, not as folklore, but as a strategic problem. A ruler who refuses to kneel, refuses conversion, refuses submission, and survives. Elsewhere along the Indian Ocean rim, resistance flares and fades. Ports fall, kings negotiate. Treaties are signed under duress. Ullal does neither. It resists long enough to become inconvenient, long enough to expose the limits of imperial reach. And this is why her story matters beyond geography. Decades before organized anti-colonial movements. Decades before nationalist ideology. Decades before resistance is supposed to be possible. A woman rules. A port defies. An empire adjusts but never fully succeeds. Abbakka Chowta does not become famous because she wins a single decisive battle. She becomes dangerous because she refuses to end the fight on imperial terms. She denies closure. She denies dominance. She denies history, the clean victory it prefers to remember. This is not a footnote. This is a warning written into the coastline itself, and what comes next will force the Portuguese to stop treating Ullal as a nuisance and start treating it as a threat. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reaches Calicut and proves what Europe has suspected for decades: the Indian Ocean can be entered, mapped, and dominated by force. What follows is not exploration, but systemization. The Portuguese crown does not seek land first. It seeks choke points, ports, straits, river mouths, places where trade must pass or die. From this logic, the Estado da Índia is born. Goa becomes the administrative heart. Calicut the prize. The Arabian Sea, a controlled corridor. And around this network a new rule is imposed, the Cartaz system. Every ship must carry a Portuguese license. Every voyage must be approved. No paper means confiscation. No compliance means cannon fire. Trade is no longer exchange. It is permission. For centuries before this moment, the Indian Ocean has functioned differently. It is seasonal, relational, negotiated. Arab merchants, Gujarati traders, Malabar ports, Southeast Asian sailors operate on trust, custom, and mutual dependency. No single power owns the sea. The Portuguese do not enter this world. They overwrite it, and overwriting requires violence. Merchant ships are seized, harbors bombarded, rulers coerced into treaties they do not control. Those who comply are left nominally independent but strategically hollow. Those who resist are made examples of. The message is consistent: submission is cheaper than autonomy. Along the Kanara Coast, this pressure concentrates. The coastline here is broken by estuaries and mangroves, not wide-open harbors. Rivers like the Netravati slice inland, creating natural corridors for trade and ambush alike. Ports such as Ullal are small, but they sit exactly where maritime control becomes fragile. Too shallow for large galleons, too complex for maps drawn in Lisbon. This is the triangle of control. Goa to the north, Calicut to the south, Kanara in between. Whoever dominates this middle stretch can interrupt everything. Ullal sits at the throat of that system. To the Portuguese, this should be simple. Demand tribute. Impose cartaz. Install a compliant ruler if necessary. It works elsewhere. It should work here. But Tulu Nadu does not respond as expected. The Chowta dynasty is not an imported court propped up by outside legitimacy. It is deeply local, integrated into regional trade language and landholding systems. Its power does not rely on Portuguese recognition. More importantly, its succession follows Alia Santana, a matrilineal system that does not treat female rule as an anomaly. Authority here is functional, not symbolic. When Abbakka Chowta ascends, the Portuguese are not facing a novelty. They are facing continuity. Trade continues through Ullal without cartaz. Arab merchants dock openly. Goods move inland beyond Portuguese reach. Every such voyage undermines the credibility of the entire system. If one port can refuse, others may follow. If one queen can survive defiance, the illusion of inevitability fractures. This is why Ullal becomes a front line, not because it is rich, not because it is large, but because it proves resistance is possible. The conflict is no longer about customs, duties, or harbor fees. It is about who sets the rules of the sea. A global empire insists on monopoly. A coastal kingdom insists on precedent. One side needs dominance to function. The other needs only endurance. And endurance in this geography favors those who understand the land better than the map. By the time open conflict escalates, this is already a war of systems. Cannon versus current. Paper versus tide. Empire versus coastline. And into this pressure zone steps Rani Abbakka Chowta, not as a rebel reacting to invasion, but as a ruler defending an order older than European control and far more resilient than it appears. What the Portuguese believe is a local obstruction is, in fact, a structural challenge. They will learn that too late. The Chowta dynasty does not rise from conquest or foreign sanction. It emerges from land, lineage, and trade woven into the fabric of Tulu Nadu long before Portuguese sails appear on the horizon. Jain in faith, Digambara in tradition, the Chowtas rule without spectacle. Their authority is administrative, not theatrical. Taxes are predictable. Trade is protected. Law is local. Ullal is not a capital built to impress outsiders. It is a working port, warehouses close to the water, temples and mosques within walking distance, markets that follow the rhythm of tides rather than royal ceremony. Power here is practical, not performative. This matters because Abbakka Chowta is not raised to symbolize unity or inspire myth. She is raised to govern. Alia Santana defines succession through the female line. Property authority continuity pass through women not as exception but as system. When Abbakka is identified as heir, there is no debate about legitimacy. There is only preparation. She is trained to read contracts before she reads poetry, to listen to merchants before courtiers, to understand why ships wait for certain winds and why certain routes are never written down. Trade is not treated as secondary to warfare. It is the reason warfare exists. Her education is broad because her kingdom is exposed. Diplomacy with neighboring rulers, negotiation with Arab traders, familiarity with Islamic courts and Hindu chieftains alike. Religious difference is not a fault line here. It is a fact of geography. And always there is the sea. Abbakka learns to read tides as others read calendars, to recognize when a river mouth is navigable and when it is a trap. She understands that large ships need depth, time, and visibility. Small vessels need only timing. This knowledge does not come from theory. It comes from watching sailors work and listening when they speak. The barrier she faces is not internal resistance. It is scale. The Portuguese bring a global economy backed by gunpowder. They possess ships designed for oceanic dominance cannons that shatter walls and a legal framework that transforms violence into policy. Against this, Ullal has limited manpower, modest fortifications, and no hope of matching firepower directly. Which means survival cannot be about parity. It must be about asymmetry. Abbakka is prepared for this before the first demand arrives from Goa. She does not need to be convinced that compliance will hollow her kingdom. She sees the pattern elsewhere along the coast. Rulers who accept cartas retain titles, but lose agency. Ports that submit keep walls, but surrender profit. Once trade is licensed, independence becomes decorative. So when pressure comes, her choice is not emotional. It is structural. She will not fight on the Portuguese terms. She will not defend open sea or daylight harbors. She will defend flows of goods, of information, of people. She will trade resilience for spectacle, longevity for glory. This is not a queen stepping into crisis unprepared. This is a ruler whose entire formation points toward refusal. And when the moment arrives to decide, there is no hesitation because the decision has already been made by the system that shaped her. What follows is not a clash of armies. It is the imposition of a new rule set, and once that rule is declared, there is no path back to neutrality. The demand arrives as expected. Tribute, compliance, cartas. The language is formal, almost courteous, wrapped in the assumption that refusal is unthinkable. Other ports have already accepted. Others will follow. Ullal is invited to be reasonable. Abbakka Chowta declines without negotiation. There is no counteroffer, no delay, no symbolic concession. Trade with Arab merchants continues openly. Ships enter and leave Ullal without Portuguese papers. The message is clear enough to reach Goa without translation. This port will not be managed. With that refusal, the conflict locks into place. Abbakka does not attempt to defend every mile of coastline. She redraws the battlefield entirely. The open sea is abandoned to the Portuguese. Daylight is conceded. Visibility is surrendered. Instead, the fight is moved inward into river mouths and estuaries where charts fail and deep keels become liabilities. This is the new rule. No engagements in open water. No daylight landings. No static defense of walls. Attacks occur at night, when tides turn and wind shifts. Small boats replace large fleets. Fire replaces cannon. Agnivana arrows and burning projectiles are launched from positions that vanish before retaliation is possible. The goal is not destruction for its own sake. It is disruption. Sails burn. Rigging collapses. Anchored ships drift into each other. Crews panic in unfamiliar waters. Command structures fracture under confusion rather than force. Each failed landing reinforces the lesson. Portuguese commanders arrive expecting resistance that can be punished. They encounter a system that refuses to present itself as a target. And yet Ullal continues to function. Merchants arrive because protection is real, not promised. Taxes are collected because authority is intact, not imposed. Alliances hold because the queen does not frame the war as religious. Hindu warriors fight alongside Muslim sailors, not under banners of faith but under contracts of survival. The cause is shared access, not shared belief. The escalation follows a predictable loop. Portuguese fleets approach Ullal. Landing attempts are repelled or harassed. Losses accumulate without decisive battle. The fleet withdraws to regroup. Each cycle strengthens Abbakka's position. Her reputation spreads along the coast, not as legend, but as data. Ullal is difficult. Ullal is dangerous. Ullal is not worth casual conquest. This is precisely the problem. Empires tolerate enemies they can defeat. They cannot tolerate examples. Ullal proves that defiance does not automatically result in annihilation. That trade can persist outside imperial permission. That a small kingdom properly positioned can deny closure. The Portuguese response hardens. More resources are committed. The objective shifts from compliance to demonstration. Ullal must be broken publicly, decisively, in a way that restores fear. By the late 1560s, patience has expired. This is no longer a series of punitive expeditions. It is preparation for final resolution. A commander is chosen who believes in overwhelming force. A campaign is planned not to negotiate but to erase. For the first time, Abbakka Chowta faces the possibility that Ullal may fall. And this time the Portuguese believe they have learned enough to win. They are wrong. João Peixoto arrives with a mandate, not a question. He is not sent to probe or pressure. He is sent to end the problem. Portuguese records describe the campaign with confidence bordering on relief. Ullal will be taken. Resistance will be crushed. The coastline will be quiet again. This time the landing succeeds. Overwhelming force achieves what patience could not. Portuguese troops breach the defenses, occupy the town, and raise their banners over Ullal. For the first time in decades, the port appears neutralized. Abbakka Chowta disappears from view. To outside observers, the pattern looks familiar. A small ruler finally overwhelmed by imperial scale. The Portuguese celebrate as if the war has ended. Night falls and discipline loosens. Victory is assumed to be permanent. Ships lie at anchor in the bay. Officers feast. Guards relax. The occupation behaves like a conclusion rather than a pause. Abbakka is not gone. She has withdrawn inland, not in defeat, but in preparation. She seeks refuge where Portuguese authority cannot reach easily within a mosque. Not as a religious gesture, but as a political one. Protection here is communal, not symbolic. The alliance holds even in retreat. 200 warriors gather quietly. They are not the full strength of Ullal. They are what remains mobile, loyal, and invisible. There is no speech, no promise of glory. The objective is narrow: break the occupation, kill its commander, restore control before dawn. The attack begins after midnight. Boats slip back through familiar channels. No banners, no drums. Fire breaks out almost simultaneously across the occupied port. Confusion spreads faster than orders. Soldiers wake to smoke, not commands. Narrow streets turn into traps. Portuguese formations collapse under pressure they cannot orient toward. This is not a siege, it is a strike. Abbakka's forces move with precision, not fury. Targets are chosen, routes are known, retreat paths are planned before engagement begins. João Peixoto is killed in the fighting. 70 Portuguese soldiers are taken prisoner. By the time dawn approaches, the occupation has disintegrated. Ullal is free again. The significance is immediate and irreversible. A Portuguese commander has been killed, not at sea or in distant skirmish, but inside a supposedly secured port. The message travels faster than official reports. Ullal is not merely resistant. It is lethal. For Abbakka, this is not a triumph to be displayed. It is a correction of the board. Control is restored. Trade resumes. Prisoners are dealt with as leverage, not spectacle. The system continues. For the Portuguese, the implications are severe. Failure is no longer deniable. The cost of underestimating Ullal is now written in blood. The problem cannot be delegated to routine expeditions. It demands escalation beyond local suppression. The conflict pivots. Guerrilla success is no longer enough. As long as Portuguese bases along the coast remain intact, Ullal will always face renewed pressure. Defense alone cannot resolve a system designed to regenerate aggression. Abbakka understands this shift immediately. Survival now requires interruption at a higher level. If Ullal is to remain independent, the network that sustains Portuguese power must be attacked. Not just ships, not just landings, but supply lines, allied ports, and regional strongholds. The war is about to leave Ullal behind, and once it does, it will no longer be possible to contain it as a local rebellion. The lesson is clear. Skillful resistance can humiliate an empire, but it cannot dismantle one on its own. Abbakka Chowta has mastered coastal defense. She has perfected night warfare, river ambush, and denial of landings. But as long as Portuguese strongholds remain intact, Ullal will be forced to fight the same war again and again. So the strategy changes. This is the moment where a defender becomes a belligerent. Abbakka no longer treats the Portuguese presence as a series of intrusions to be repelled. She treats it as a system that must be disrupted. Ports feed fleets. Fortresses anchor control. Governors rely on regional allies to project force beyond Goa. Break those links, and the empire bleeds without a decisive battle. She begins building alliances outward, not symbolic coalitions but operational ones. The Zamorin of Calicut, long hostile to Portuguese interference. The sultanates of Bijapur and Ahmednagar, each with their own reasons to resist maritime encroachment. These are not unified by ideology. They are unified by threat assessment. The agreement is simple. The Portuguese cannot be allowed uncontested bases along the western coast. With this alignment, the war widens. Targets are chosen for impact, not prestige. Mangalore becomes the focus, a strategic port whose loss would disrupt Portuguese logistics along the Kanara Coast. It is fortified, garrisoned, and considered secure. The attack is swift and coordinated. Abbakka's forces contribute local intelligence, river access, and coastal maneuverability. Allied troops apply pressure inland. The Portuguese are forced to fight on multiple fronts without the advantage of choosing terrain. In the chaos, Admiral Mascarenhas is killed. The death of a senior Portuguese commander marks a turning point. This is no longer a series of isolated embarrassments. It is open warfare against imperial infrastructure. For a brief moment, Portuguese control along this stretch of coast fractures. Mangalore is lost temporarily. Supply routes are interrupted. Confidence wavers. The response from Goa is immediate. Reinforcements are ordered. Fortifications are strengthened. Commanders are warned not to underestimate local rulers. The Portuguese adapt as empires do. They learn. They consolidate. They reassert presence with heavier force. But something has changed permanently. Abbakka Chowta is no longer seen merely as the ruler of a troublesome port. She is identified as a destabilizing actor capable of coordinating regional opposition. Her name appears in reports not as a curiosity but as a threat multiplier. And yet she does not attempt to hold captured territory. This is critical. She withdraws once objectives are achieved. She does not garrison Mangalore. She does not overextend. The goal is never replacement of Portuguese rule. It is denial of permanence. Every advance is temporary. Every withdrawal is intentional. This frustrates imperial logic. The Portuguese fight wars to occupy, to administer, to extract. Abbakka fights wars to interrupt, exhaust, and escape. There is no capital to seize that ends the conflict. No treaty that resolves it. The enemy refuses to stand still long enough to be finished. Over time, the cost accumulates. More ships are required to secure the same waters. More soldiers are stationed to protect fewer ports. Profits thin. Morale suffers. The Indian Ocean remains controlled in theory, but porous in practice. For Abbakka, the burden is heavier. Alliances are fragile. Resources are finite. Constant vigilance strains internal cohesion. Resistance that lasts decades begins to attract enemies from within as well as without. The war has expanded beyond Ullal, but it has also expanded into her own court. And this is where the next danger emerges. Not from the sea, but from betrayal. Empires expect rebellion from the outside. They are less prepared for erosion from within. For Abbakka Chowta, the most dangerous fracture does not come from Portuguese canon but from a familiar name inside her own power structure. Lakshmapa Arasa defects. The betrayal is quiet, administrative, and devastating. Defensive routines are exposed. Patrol patterns compromised. River access points revealed. Information that took decades to refine is suddenly no longer exclusive. For the Portuguese, this is more valuable than firepower. Abbakka is isolated. Allies remain but trust narrows. Every delay becomes suspect. Every failure invites doubt. The court that once functioned on cohesion now operates under strain. The cost of permanent resistance becomes visible not only in resources but in loyalty. Her response is revealing. She does not launch purges. She does not seek personal revenge. She does not sacrifice stability for emotional satisfaction. The traitor is noted contained where possible but not allowed to dictate the rhythm of governance. Ullal continues to function. This restraint is not weakness. It is discipline. Abbakka understands that internal collapse would deliver what the Portuguese have failed to achieve by force. The system must hold even when individuals fracture. Her priority remains the same: protect the port, protect trade, protect continuity. But isolation has consequences. The Portuguese adapt their pressure. Landings become more precise. Raids strike closer to the heart of Ullal. Losses increase. The margin for error shrinks. Every night operation carries higher risk. The war of attrition, once tilted in Abbakka's favor, begins to grind. By 1581, the situation shifts decisively. Accounts diverge here. Some sources suggest a coordinated capture. Others imply betrayal enabled her arrest. What is consistent is the outcome. Abbakka Chowta is taken prisoner. She does not surrender publicly. There is no recorded submission. Tradition holds that she dies in captivity. The circumstances are unclear. The empire does not stage her defeat. It absorbs it quietly. For the Portuguese, this is not a triumph worth celebrating. Too much time has passed. Too many commanders are dead. Too many resources have been spent. The victory, if it can be called that, is administrative rather than spectacular. And Ullal does not collapse. Resistance fades, but the port does not become a model colony. Trade never fully normalizes under Portuguese control. The memory of defiance lingers in practice, not proclamation. Historians later struggle with the timeline. Some propose that there was more than one Abbakka successive rulers whose actions merged into a single figure. Others argue the records are simply incomplete, distorted by colonial archives and oral transmission. What matters is not the precision of the biography. What matters is the continuity of resistance. Whether one woman or several, the pattern holds. Decades of refusal. A system that outlasts personalities. A port that denies empire the satisfaction of clean victory. Abbakka Chowta does not disappear from history because she fails. She disappears because her kind of success does not fit imperial narratives. It does not end with coronation or conquest. It ends with exhaustion, ambiguity, and unresolved defiance. And that, for an empire, is the most uncomfortable legacy of all. The Portuguese records reduce her to a problem that eventually stops appearing in reports. Local memory does the opposite. It carries her forward, reshaping her as it passes her along. This is how Abbakka Chowta survives history, not as a statue but as a transmission. First, she exists in enemy archives. Portuguese commanders write her name with irritation, sometimes disbelief. A queen who refuses tribute. A port that will not close. A coastline that consumes resources without yielding authority. These documents are not meant to preserve her. They are meant to explain failure. Yet they do. Against intention, they record her competence. Then she moves into oral memory. In Tulu Nadu, her story is spoken before it is written. It enters folk songs, local retellings, yakshagana performances where rulers are judged not by piety but by resolve. In Buddha-Kola traditions, her defiance becomes spiritual presence, not divine but enduring. She is remembered as someone who stood where standing was costly. Each transmission changes her slightly. The dates blur, the battles compress. The woman becomes larger than the archive allows. This is not distortion by ignorance. It is preservation by relevance. What matters is not the exact sequence, but the pattern, refusal, adaptation, survival. Colonial history has little use for this kind of figure. Abbakka does not fit the arc of conquest or collaboration. She does not convert. She does not found an empire. She does not lose in a way that can be celebrated as inevitable. Her resistance does not climax. It persists. So she is sidelined. Textbooks move from Vasco da Gama to Goa, from Goa to empire, skipping the coastlines that never fully submitted. Anti-colonial narratives often arrive centuries later, searching for mass movements and unified ideologies. Abbakka predates them. She fights before resistance has a name. And yet her legacy is structural. She demonstrates that maritime empires are vulnerable at thresholds. That control of the ocean means little if river mouths remain hostile. That alliances based on interest can outlast those based on identity. That female rule, when normalized by system, produces governance without spectacle. Most importantly, she proves that power does not require permission to exist. In modern India, her name resurfaces deliberately. Statues appear along the coast. Festivals are renamed. The Indian Coast Guard names a ship in her honor. This is not nostalgia. It is recognition of strategic lineage. Coastal defense did not begin with modern navies. It began with understanding, terrain, timing, and denial. Abbakka Chowta is not remembered because she was exceptional. She is remembered because she was operational. She did not ask to rule. She ruled. She did not ask forgiveness to resist. She resisted. She did not kneel, because kneeling would have ended everything she was responsible for protecting. If Indian history had produced more rulers like Abbakka, competent, locally grounded, structurally defiant, colonial domination would not have been impossible. But it would have been slower, costlier, and far less complete. That is why her story was allowed to fade. And that is why restoring it matters. Because history is not only written by those who win, it is also erased by those who are threatened by examples. Abbakka Chowta was one such example, and the coastline remembers her still. The coastline does not remember names, it remembers patterns. Tides that reverse, channels that vanish, fires that appear where maps insist there is nothing. Abbakka Chowta's legacy lives there, embedded in behavior rather than biography. What she proves is not that empires can be defeated outright. It is something more uncomfortable, that empires depend on cooperation they pretend is submission. The Portuguese never fully lose the Indian Ocean. They continue to dominate shipping lanes, fortify ports, and enforce cartas where they can. But their control is uneven, negotiated, constantly patched. Ullal exposes that weakness. Power, when stretched across oceans, is fragile at the edges. Abbakka does not challenge Portugal at its center. She never sails toward Lisbon. She never seeks recognition from European courts. Instead, she denies the empire the ability to normalize her coast. Every expedition that fails to conclude costs more than it gains. Every temporary victory demands reinforcement. Over decades, the arithmetic shifts. This is how resistance works before ideology. There is no manifesto, no call for liberation, no imagined future nation. There is only refusal to allow an external system to overwrite a functioning local one. Abbakka's war is not against foreigners, it is against monopoly. That distinction matters, because it allows alliances that empires do not expect. Hindu rulers cooperate with Muslim sailors. Jain courts protect mosques. Trade continues across religious lines because commerce predates conquest. The Portuguese, who divide populations to rule efficiently, struggle to fracture a system that does not organize itself around exclusion. This is why Abbakka's resistance lasts longer than her life. Even after her capture, the coast remains difficult. Control must be asserted repeatedly. Garrisons must be rotated. Surveillance increases. The cost of administration rises. What should have been a profitable corridor becomes a persistent drain. From the imperial perspective, this is tolerable, but irritating. From the historical perspective, it is revealing. Colonial dominance was never absolute. It was negotiated daily against geography, logistics, and local competence. Figures like Abbakka Chowta make that negotiation visible. And visibility is dangerous. That is why her story fragments. Portuguese sources minimize her end. Local traditions expand her presence. Modern historiography debates whether there was one Abbakka or several. The question itself reveals the problem. When resistance is sustained, archives look for singular conclusions. When they cannot find them, they look for errors. But continuity does not require a single body. Whether one ruler or successive queens acting under the same system, the effect is identical. Ullal remains unmanageable for decades. Portuguese plans adjust around it. The coastline shapes strategy rather than submits to it. This is the legacy that matters. Not a dramatic execution, not a clean defeat, but a prolonged refusal that forces a global empire to operate below its desired level of control. Abbakka Chowta matters because she demonstrates that history is not only shaped by those who conquer capitals, it is shaped by those who deny convenience, who make domination expensive, who refuse to disappear quickly enough to be forgotten cleanly. Her story challenges the idea that colonialism advanced smoothly until modern resistance emerged. It did not. It advanced unevenly, negotiated at river mouths by rulers who understood their terrain better than any admiral. Remembering Abbakka is not about celebrating defiance for its own sake. It is about recognizing competence where history preferred silence. Because once you see how she held Ullal with timing, restraint, and structural clarity, the question is no longer why she resisted. The question is how many others did the same long enough to matter but quietly enough to be erased. And how different the past might look if we learned to read coastlines, archives, and power the way she did. History often asks the wrong question. It asks who conquered, who ruled longest, whose flag remained flying at the end. Abbakka Chowta forces a different inquiry. Not who won, but who controlled the terms of engagement, and for how long. For more than 4 decades, a small coastal kingdom denied a maritime empire the ability to simplify its rule. That duration matters. Empires plan in decades. Shipping routes, fortifications, administrative chains are designed for stability. Resistance that lasts a season is noise. Resistance that lasts a generation reshapes policy. Ullal did that. The Portuguese never fully trusted this stretch of coast again. They fortified more heavily than expected. They diverted ships that could have been used elsewhere. They documented a ruler they could not neutralize cleanly. Each adjustment is evidence of constraint. This is what competence looks like when it does not seek spectacle. Abbakka does not leave behind a new empire. She leaves behind friction, and friction is expensive. It slows movement. It increases risk. It forces caution where confidence once ruled. Over time, that friction compounds. This is why her resistance cannot be reduced to identity alone. She is not remembered because she was a woman who fought an empire. She is remembered because she governed effectively under pressure. Gender mattered only insofar as her society allowed continuity through Alia Santana. What mattered more was preparation, local intelligence, and refusal to adopt the enemy's logic of war. She did not mirror Portuguese strategy. She invalidated it. Open seas were abandoned. Daylight was avoided. Fortresses were bypassed. Fire was used not for destruction but for disruption. Retreat was chosen over symbolic sacrifice. Every decision prioritized sustainability over drama. That is not romantic resistance. It is administrative warfare. This is also why her story unsettles modern narratives. Colonial history prefers binaries: conqueror and conquered, victor and victim. Abbakka exists in between. She is neither assimilated nor annihilated. She holds long enough to matter, then disappears without providing a satisfying endpoint. So she becomes inconvenient. Inconvenient for colonial archives that want resolution. Inconvenient for nationalist stories that want mass movements. Inconvenient for simplified histories that want heroes to fall cleanly. Yet her legacy persists where it began along the coast. In operational memory, in performance, in ritual, in place names and patrol routes. In the logic of coastal defense that still prioritizes denial over dominance. When a modern Coast Guard vessel bears her name, it is not homage alone. It is acknowledgement that maritime security begins at thresholds, not horizons. Abbakka Chowta did not ask permission to rule. She did not ask forgiveness to resist. She did not seek to be remembered. She did what the system required of her. And that may be the most enduring lesson of all. History is not shaped only by those who change the world. It is shaped by those who prevent it from being changed too easily. Those who hold ground long enough to expose the cost of control. Those who force power to reveal its limits. Abbakka was one such ruler, not a legend imposed on the past but a structure embedded within it. If history feels incomplete without her, that absence is not accidental. It is the residue of a choice to look away from competence that did not serve empire and to forget resistance that worked without ever declaring itself victorious. Restoring her story does not rewrite history. It clarifies it. And once seen clearly, the coastlines of the past no longer look quiet. They look contested. They always were. When Abbakka Chowta is placed back into history, something subtle shifts. The map does not change, but the logic does. Colonial expansion stops looking inevitable and starts looking negotiated. Smooth lines of control fracture into zones of effort, compromise, and strain. This matters because inevitability is one of empire's greatest tools. If domination appears, natural resistance appears futile. Abbakka's record disrupts that illusion. She does not defeat Portugal. She does something more precise. She proves that even at the height of European maritime power control was conditional. Conditional on cooperation, conditional on local knowledge, conditional on rulers choosing convenience over sovereignty. She chose otherwise. Her refusal forces us to reconsider scale. Ullal is not large. Tulunadu is not a continental power. Abbakka does not command massive armies. And yet the Portuguese adjust strategy around her for decades. That alone dismantles the assumption that only large states shape outcomes. Power, in her case, is positional. She controls a threshold where sea meets land, where empires transition from dominance to dependence. Ships need ports. Ports need compliance. Once compliance is withdrawn, superiority loses its clarity. Cannons cannot fire at tides. Treaties cannot navigate mangroves. Abbakka understands this instinctively. She never confuses resistance with spectacle. She does not pursue climactic battles. She avoids martyrdom. She values withdrawal when survival requires it. Her leadership is defined less by what she attacks than by what she refuses to offer predictability. That refusal ripples outward. Portuguese commanders rotate faster. Costs rise quietly. The empire absorbs the expense, but the margin tightens. Elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, other rulers observe. Some comply faster. Others hedge. Resistance does not need to spread universally to matter. It only needs to exist convincingly. This is why Abbakka's story challenges modern expectations. We are trained to look for turning points, declarations, endings. She offers none. Her war has no single, decisive moment. It stretches, adapts, and eventually dissolves into administrative resolution rather than battlefield collapse. But history is not only shaped by endings. It is shaped by duration, by how long systems are denied efficiency, by how long dominance is forced to operate imperfectly, by how long the cost of control outweighs its benefits. Abbakka Chowta extends that cost. Her disappearance from mainstream history is not proof of insignificance. It is proof of discomfort. Stories like hers complicate narratives built on clean arcs. They demand attention to logistics, geography, and governance rather than charisma or conquest. They remind us that resistance does not always announce itself as revolution. Sometimes it looks like continuity under pressure. A port that keeps trading. A ruler who keeps collecting taxes. A coastline that refuses to become quiet. Abbakka's legacy is not a banner raised at the end of history. It is a question left unresolved. If one small kingdom led by a woman trained not for symbolism but for administration, we could deny an empire closure for 40 years. What else have we misunderstood about the past? What other coastlines held? What other rulers refused? What other systems survived long enough to matter only to be written out later? History remembers conquest because conquest leaves monuments. It forgets competence because competence leaves friction. Abbakka Chowta left friction in the machinery of empire. And that friction, once noticed, changes how the entire machine is understood. Not unstoppable, not inevitable, but contested tide by tide, night by night by rulers who knew exactly where they stood and refused to move. To understand Abbakka Chowta fully, the frame has to widen one last time, not to celebrate her but to place her where she belongs, inside the mechanics of power. She does not sit at the margins of history. She sits at a pressure point. Empires expand fastest where resistance collapses early. They struggle where resistance is competent, local, and persistent. Abbakka represents the second category. She does not stop Portuguese expansion across the Indian Ocean, but she bends it. She forces detours. She introduces uncertainty into a system designed for certainty. This is why her resistance is remembered unevenly. European archives reduce her to episodes. Indian memory carries her as presence. Modern history hesitates, unsure how to categorize a ruler who neither founds a dynasty of conquest nor falls in a climactic defeat. But power does not only reveal itself through beginnings and endings, it reveals itself through duration. Abbakka's power lasts. It lasts because it is embedded in systems rather than personality. In succession, laws that normalize female authority. In alliances that privilege interest over identity. In tactics that prioritize survivability over spectacle. When she is captured, the logic she used does not vanish overnight. It has already reshaped how the coast is governed. This is why Portuguese control never feels absolute here. They hold forts but not trust. They enforce licenses but not obedience. They dominate sea lanes but not river mouths. Every layer of control requires reinforcement. Every reinforcement signals vulnerability. Over time, the empire learns to live with friction rather than eliminate it. That adaptation is quiet, bureaucratic, and revealing. Abbakka Chowta teaches a hard lesson about power. Domination is not the same as control. Control requires cooperation, and cooperation once withdrawn is difficult to restore by force alone. Her story also reframes gender in pre-colonial politics. She is not exceptional because she rules. She is exceptional because she rules effectively under sustained pressure. Her society makes that possible by design, not concession. Ilha Santana does not produce queens as anomalies. It produces rulers as administrators. That distinction matters. When modern audiences encounter Abbakka, they often search for inspiration. That impulse is understandable but incomplete. Her value is not symbolic. It is instructional. She shows how small polities survive large systems, how geography can be weaponized without armies, how refusal applied consistently reshapes outcomes without ever announcing victory. She also shows why such figures are easy to erase. They do not overthrow empires. They do not inaugurate new eras. They do not fit cleanly into nationalist or colonial triumphs. They complicate. And history, especially written history, prefers simplicity. Restoring Abbakka Chowta is not about adding a forgotten hero to a crowded pantheon. It is about restoring a missing category of power-competent resistance that works long enough to matter, then fades without spectacle. Once that category is acknowledged, the past changes texture. Coastlines become active spaces, not empty margins. Local rulers become strategic actors, not passive obstacles. Colonial expansion becomes contested from its first moments, not challenged only at its end. Abbakka Chowta stands as proof that history's silence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of selection. What was remembered served empire. What endured without serving it was allowed to blur. But blur is not disappearance. Along the Kanara Coast, the tides still reverse. River mouths still shift. Night still erases certainty. These are not metaphors. They are the conditions under which Abbakka ruled. She did not ask the empire to leave. She did not wait for permission to resist. She made control expensive enough that domination never felt complete. That is her legacy. Not conquest, not martyrdom, but competence applied over time at exactly the place where empire was weakest. And once you learn to see history that way, you stop asking why figures like Abbakka were forgotten. You start asking who benefited from that forgetting, and what other pressure points still unexamined once held just as firmly.